We have with us tonight Conservative MP for South Northamptonshire, former Cabinet Minister Dame Andrea Leadsom, Andrea to her friends. Fleur Anderson is Shadow Cabinet Office Minister and Labour MP for Putney. James Ball is Global Editor of the Bureau of Investigative Journalism and the European Columnist and the author of a brilliant book which I published. And Coughlin is Defence Editor and Foreign Affairs Columnist for the Telegraph. He joins us by Zoom. So get your calls in 0345 6060 973.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, welcome to you all. Let's go to our first caller. It's Gavin in Maidstone. Gavin, what's your question, please?
Oh, thank you, Iain. My question is that obviously the West have said that they will not enforce.
Gavin, have we lost you? He's been cut off in his prime. He's still on my screen, but let's see if we can get him back. In the meantime, I've got his question on the screen here as well. It's the UK and the West are refusing to go for a no-fly zone, even amongst the war crimes. But how bad would the images on our TV screens have to get before we changed our position? Coughlin, let's come to you first.
Greetings, Iain. Good to be with you and good to be on the panel. Well, I think we're in a very difficult position so far as no-fly zones are concerned. I was listening to General Sir Adrian Bradshaw this morning, a former NATO commander, and basically his argument was if we want to impose and enforce no-fly zones, we risk starting World War III, because by doing that, by enforcing it, you effectively have NATO at war with Russia. And Russia, being the world's largest nuclear-armed power, becomes a very different proposition entirely. But I think the moral argument, which I think is in the question here, is a very pressing one. And I think the longer this conflict goes on, the more pressure there will be from publics around Europe, around the world, that something is done. I mean, the old cry, let's do something. But if we're going to do something, let's not forget the consequences of that action.
Fleur Anderson.
I think we're going to be in a lot of agreement here this evening, because I agree that we cannot start shooting down Russian planes. That's what it means to enforce the no-fly zone if we actually take that action, and that would lead to escalation. And we know the consequences of going into war in other countries. You've got to have a long-term view. We absolutely could not do that now. And that's why, and I agree, there's a feeling of helplessness. I think across the country we're thinking, what can we do? Can we do more? What can we do to stop this? And I absolutely understand that. But that's why we're looking at all these other things to do: military support, cutting the Russian out of the international banking system, sanctions, all of those things. They've got to come a long way before we go anywhere towards boots on the ground or military action, which is what enforcing a no-fly zone is.
Some people say it's just delaying the inevitable, because if Putin gets his way in Ukraine, he will move elsewhere, whether it's Georgia, whether it's the Baltic states, Moldova, who knows. But at some point, some commentators are saying there will have to be a confrontation.
But we're nowhere near that yet. We don't know what's going to happen next with Putin. He's very unpredictable as well. We didn't know a week or two ago that we'd be here. So we've got to hold firm to what we're doing now and do all that we can, but not military action.
Andrea.
Well, I'm going to agree with Fleur and with Con. You know, I think we can't have a no-fly zone, not least of which because that then makes it very difficult to actually be shooting the right people down. I mean, the Ukrainian Air Force also needs to be able to use its own airspace. And so it's not just about Russian planes, but of course, as both panellists have said, it is absolutely vital that we don't find ourselves in a kind of dogfight with Russian jets that takes NATO into a war with Russia. That would be disastrous. However, we are doing so much. And I think what's very interesting is the power of economic sanctions on, for example, the Russian central bank. I mean, that is an unprecedented sanction, is to deny Russian central bank access to their own foreign currency reserves, is actually going to really harm Putin's ability to manoeuvre. And of course, it's not as fast and as, in some ways, satisfying as would be shooting down, Russian jets. But at the same time, it is going to have a very, very strong impact on Putin's manoeuvrability over the coming weeks and months. I think we've got to absolutely focus on that.
James Ball.
So, at the risk of becoming tedious, I agree that we can't do a no-fly zone. I mean, honestly, as well, to effectively enforce a no-fly zone, which sounds like quite a peaceful thing, you don't only have to have a credible threat to shoot down planes, you often need to take out command and control, which would mean striking ground targets on Russian territory, which, when you're dealing with two nuclear sort of armed powers, as NATO is and as Russia is, means that you are very, very rapidly escalating to the hottest of hot conflicts. And I can't imagine what pictures would be the same as that. But I think after so many years of underreacting to Russian aggression and letting Putin think that there was a low price for intervention, I think a lot of us are left feeling almost reflexively that the reactions this time must be an underreaction too, that we mustn't be doing enough. And so we're assuming what's coming out isn't enough. And yet a huge number of sacred cows have been slain in the last week. Germany is committing to spend 2% of its GDP. It is exporting arms directly to Ukraine. I think the first actually arrived today. You are seeing actual military aid going. Russia will not find any kind of easy victory here. They may take the city, but how will they ever hold it? Most Iraqis welcomed the US, or at least a small majority welcomed the US into Iraq. A very small resistance, armed with much, much less modern equipment than Europe and America could send to Ukraine, caused absolute devastation there. And so we will find that these indirect measures are imposing a vastly higher cost on Russia than Putin ever calculated. Could we have done more earlier? Should we have done more earlier? Yes. But that doesn't mean that we need to go all the way to 100 and to actions that it's very hard to see how you could ever pull back from without actually resulting in a nuclear exchange, which surely none of us want.
Yeah, and we have to all pay huge tribute to the incredible Ukrainian resistance. I mean, they really, it seems completely of their own volition, are holding back this tide of Russian aggression, which is unbelievable. And of course, being helped as much as we possibly can without actually escalating the conflict. And again, if we did get involved, that escalation would be unbearable, unthinkable. Many more civilians and soldiers would be caught up in that.
Can I just ask the two MPs on the panel, what are your postbags or email inboxes looking like? Because I've noticed in the last 2 or 3 days on LBC, we're getting far more calls on this no-fly zone issue than anything else, mostly from people saying that they think it should be implemented. What are your constituents telling you, Andrea?
I've got dozens. We're not quite over 100 yet, which actually isn't that many emails. I'm not getting lots of emails about installing a no-fly zone. What I am getting is people saying, what can we do? What can we do? And I must say, just this week, I was told that there will be a hotel in my constituency that's being designated to receive Ukrainian refugees. And I think a lot of people in my area are saying, how can we help? So I'm saying to them, when our refugees arrive, we can make them very welcome. Of course, because Ukraine is insisting that males between 18 and 60 stay and fight, there's a lot of women, children and older relatives who will be coming to the UK. They're likely to feel vulnerable and isolated.
Well, we might have a question on that later. I don't know that we will, but let's leave that there. Fleur, similar story?
So most people are writing in about sanctions and saying, can the sanctions go further? And so I have spoken about sanctions and outlined what we would do and pushing forward for that, a lot of which has now been agreed in the last few days. So that's what people wanted to see when I've said what we're calling for. they're saying that's what I wanted to see you calling for in Parliament. And also, people are so kind, offering so much help and support to people who will be arriving locally.
Were you both in the chamber for the applause for the Ukrainian ambassador
so moving
today?
It was an amazing moment.
I've never seen anything like it.
No, those moments in Parliament, that I will never forget that.
Because it was spontaneous, wasn't it?
Absolutely,
it wasn't orchestrated.
No, everyone just put down their things. It wasn't. No one was saying we should do this. We all felt it as one. Let's be supportive together. It was an incredible moment.
Some people on social media hesitate to say this, but they're saying, oh, well, it's typical MPs virtue signalling, saying, oh, let's all have a group hug, but they're not actually providing the means for the Ukrainians to fight back.
Well, that's clearly not true. I mean, the UK has actually been training Ukrainian soldiers since 2015 in defensive tactics. We've been providing military defensive equipment for several years, and the UK has done more than virtually anyone to provide support, direct support to the Ukrainians to be able to defend themselves and protect themselves. So I think the UK has done a lot. There's obviously more that we are doing and will do, but we've done more than most.
Con, you're sitting there very quietly, not interjecting, very well behaved.
Well, no, I am. I'm listening first of all, I'd like to say it's such a pleasure to be on a panel with a Labour MP who talks sense. Because 3 years ago,
it's a backhanded compliment.
I had to take that.
It would be a very, very different conversation indeed. And you only have to look at Diane Abbott's performance today to see what Labour was like before 3 years ago. Anyway, I made that point, but I would just pick up on what Andrea's saying there about our support. And yes, the Ukrainians have been heroic, and they're putting up an enormous fight, and they're giving the Russians a bloody nose. I mean, we don't know whether these figures of 6,000 Russian dead can be verified, but clearly the Russian advance has been disrupted. And I think that is large part due to the training that we and others, the Americans included, have given to the Ukrainians to turn them into a proper, almost counterinsurgency force. And I think whatever the outcome of this, if the Russians do succeed in occupying the cities, which is a big if, they are going to face a very long, sustained and effective resistance, and that is how we can help them. And I think as long as we sustain that, and I've also been very uplifted, to be honest, by the unity and sense of purpose that has suddenly broken out amongst the Western Alliance. The divisions of the past over big issues. Just look at the chaos that affected the end of the Afghan mission. I mean, the West now has some mettle, and long may it continue, and long may it continue to support the Ukrainian people, not the Iranian people, the Ukrainian people.
Well, we'd like to support the Iranian people, but just not the Iranian government, I think.
That's a different war.
Yes, indeed. Gavin in Maidstone. I mean, you didn't actually get to ask you a question because the line dropped, but answer your own question for me. Do you agree with the panel?
Well, I suppose my question was, at what point do the images on our screens, our TV screens, become so appalling that we have to review our position about no-fly zone? Do we see Kiev reduced to what Grozny was like in the 1990s or Dresden in 1945 before we intervene? And it seems like that we do, from what I've heard.
OK, Gavin, thank you very much indeed. More of your calls in a moment. 0345 6060 973. It's 16 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
19 minutes past 8. We have with us Andrea Leadsom, Conservative MP, Fleur Anderson, Labour MP, James Ball, all-round brilliant person, Coughlin, Defence Editor and Foreign Affairs columnist for The Telegraph, and also, in fact, you're all brilliant. I'm sounding like Giles Brandreth now, aren't I? Which is no bad thing, because I know he's listening. Let's go to William in Mill Hill. Hello, William.
Hiya, how you doing?
Hi, very well. What would you like to ask?
Right, well, just to sort of give you a bit of background to begin with, I'm coming at this as a Jewish person with Lithuanian heritage. My question, and I also want to put on the record that I find the ideas of dictators and despots deplorable, and only wish there was a world without them. What I don't understand, and what sort of, well, I guess I understand it, but it's the answers that actually rouse me up, is, Iain, why are you getting so passionate and angry with some of your callers when just a couple of years ago you had Putin assisting Assad in bombing the hell out of Syrians that were looking for freedom and democracy? I mean, what's the difference apart from their religion and colour of skin?
There is no difference, and I think if you listen back to my comments at that time, you'll find I was equally angry about that. Unfortunately, a lot of our politicians weren't. If you go back, I'm presuming you are referring back to the 2013 vote in the House of Commons, maybe?
I'm referring to the whole period where for years we did nothing. We sat by idly and allowed it to happen. And meanwhile, everybody's putting Ukrainian flags all over their houses and on their cars. It's a wonderful thing that the world and the West is coming together and is united. Right? I only wish we were united against all these maniacs all over the world that are causing nightmares. I mean, I think we have a real opportunity here to change the world. Please God, we don't end up in an absolute nightmare situation, which I think is why everybody's being somewhat measured in what they're doing here. But I just don't understand generally why when it's white Anglo-Saxons or Slovaks, right? We're up in arms, but when it's poor Syrians or Africans or North Koreans or any other nationality that we don't really seem to give much of a damn about, we just pretty much keep stum.
Well, I can look myself in the mirror and say that I was equally angry, but I completely accept the point that you're making because I think a lot of other people were not. Fleur Anderson, do you think William has a valid point there?
It's such an interesting question. So during the Bosnian War, I went out and I volunteered to be an aid worker. And I worked for Christian Aid during the war and then afterwards rebuilding villages there. And there was a feeling that this could have been me. It was so close. It was so real. It went on for many years. In a way, I hope that this conflict in Ukraine doesn't. And all the time it went on, it dominated our news and we felt that it was close. The same thing has not happened in Ethiopia with the Tigray situation now, which is absolutely shocking. Yemen is a secret war that is not covered at all. Why do we have this different approach to different wars? Do you think
one of the reasons could be the availability of television pictures, in that we're getting all the pictures here? We're not getting them from Ethiopia or other conflict spots. I mean, Syria, not to the extent that we got here. I just wonder, and I think it's not just on this. If there's a big flood in America, it's all over the TV screens. If there's a big flood in Bangladesh, it's not. And I don't think that's for a racist reason. I think it's just because we don't have the pictures.
And in Ethiopia, it's a deliberate strategy. There's a blackout there, so even relatives here can't hear what's going on with their relatives in Ethiopia or in Tigray on the front line. So it is a lack of that. But journalists should go out, and that's the challenge, isn't it? They should be going out and getting those pictures. And why don't they put the same emphasis, the same amount of impetus to go in and find those pictures and get them to us, as we are having in Ukraine, when every journalist has rushed into Kyiv, and quite rightly so, but we don't see every journalist rushing out to Addis Ababa at the moment.
James, you run the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. I'm really interested to hear your views on this.
So I help run it. There's plenty of us there.
This is your global editor.
Working hard on it.
Is there a universal editor as well?
I run the international bit.
Okay.
So we have a very good local journalism unit too. I mean, Syrians are as much like us as Ukrainians are like us. And I'm not just saying that in a sort of hippy-dippy, we're all human way. Syria had a burgeoning middle class. It had social media, smartphones. It was quite a secular nation. I have friends who came here, and I can remember sort of asking, why did you come here? And he was going, well, I'm a school teacher and I taught English. I go to France, I go to Germany, I've got to spend 3 years learning the language before I can even begin my life again. There were people who were genuinely as deeply like us and who believed our values and wanted to live in a sort of modern state and a modern democracy as we do. And yet we didn't have that same degree of fellow feeling, even when early in that conflict, the degree of social media pictures people were getting out, people were becoming citizen journalists. There was this sort of real moment where the citizens were trying to stand up against Assad before it got overridden by ISIS and this awful proxy war that Putin pushed. And I think there's a understandable reason why we were so much more reluctant to do anything there. Not necessarily a good one, but an understandable one, which is a lot of what, if we knew anything about Syria, we knew it was next to Iraq, and we were still digesting the awful, awful consequences of a deeply wrong and misguided decision to intervene in Iraq. A war many, many people here think was illegal and think made everything much worse. And so people saw Iraq too, rather than seeing a new situation. That, I think, is the forgivable reason for why we maybe just went, well, you want none of this. And once we decided we weren't going to invade, we just decided to put it out of our heads, because the guilt of deciding not to help when you've had a vote makes you not want to look at what happens. I think there is a bad reason too, which is that I do wonder whether we find it easier to see a country that is overwhelmingly white and in Europe and feel immediately more empathy than when we see people in the Middle East who look slightly different to the majority of people here.
People like us.
I hope it's not that, but I cannot help but worry that that is a factor. And I know that a lot of people of colour in the UK are pretty damn sure that's a factor.
And Andrea Leadsom, what happened over that 2013 vote, that would have sent a signal to Putin, wouldn't it, about the weakness of the West? Because Obama had put down red lines and then just decided to let Assad walk all over them.
Yeah, I mean, I see it slightly differently to James, because I do...
Got a bit of dissension on the front.
Yeah,
Thank
at
God
last.
for that.
Do you want me to punch him? Will that improve things? Yeah, we'll have a bit of a fight. No, I think, to me, that is
I don't know
one
who I
of...
put money on.
Come on, Iain, come on.
I do really.
No, I think that is one of the shameful moments of our Parliament, actually, that vote. I remember it very well, and it was actually, without any doubt, the most traumatic vote I'd done. I'd only been an MP for 3 years, so you might say, so what? But, I mean, I decided to back action because it seemed to me there are some things you just can't do. You just cannot abuse your own people in that way. It was just absolutely a level that mustn't be crossed. But because Parliament didn't support it, and then of course David Cameron had to say, well, Parliament's spoken and I'm a Democrat, so therefore we won't do anything. And I just have felt ashamed ever since. So I don't think it is the colour of the skin or the closeness to home. I don't even think it's, oh my goodness, Iraq was a disaster, we can't do that again, because that wasn't what we were proposing. And actually, in some ways, I think Theresa May's attack on military targets in Syria was in some sense a chance to set that straight, was to say, no, that's it, no more. But actually, you do have to look at, for example, the generosity of the passport access to Hong Kong residents, to say, well, it's not just about closeness to home. You know, there are times where we just can see that something is happening and we have to do something.
But there was a clear
it.
British link there. There isn't here.
Yeah, no, OK, we'll take Afghanistan then. I mean, actually, history now shows that our airlift was actually one of the biggest achieved by any country in the world, and we have provided more humanitarian assistance to Afghans who absolutely rightly deserve to get sanctuary in this country. So I just don't feel...
It's not a very high bar to fall.
I have
less
to say,
woefully
that's
short.
the first time I've heard that claim from
I can give you
anyone.
some disagreement on that if you want to.
Yeah, go for it. No, I mean, I genuinely think that with the Afghanistan, I mean, it was a disaster, an absolute disaster of foreign policy. But it is the fact that once America had decided to leave, and the intelligence was clearly wrong, the extent to which the supposedly democratic Afghan government would hold, that intelligence was wrong, and the rest of it was all in effect events. But nevertheless, in the final days, it was the UK airlift of civilians that was one of the biggest.
Let's go to Con.
First of all, I'd say that James's analysis, his comparison of Iraq and Syria is very facile. I was actually in Iraq in April 2003, and the Iraqis were very glad to see the back of Saddam Hussein. And people have forgotten that the military campaign to overthrow Saddam itself was very successful. It was after the success of the military campaign, when the neocons were involved, that the whole thing unraveled. But let's not get into the Iraq war again. In terms of covering Syria, last week was the 10th anniversary of the murder of my dear friend Marie Colvin by the Assad regime. She was covering that for the Sunday Times, and the Assad regime found out where she was courtesy of her mobile phone and blew her to pieces. And as a result of that and other actions, it became increasingly difficult for journalists to cover the conflict. And the question was about, the images of what is going on in Ukraine at the moment. And, the way the Russians are going to proceed with this offensive is going to make it very, very difficult for journalists to operate there. And very quickly, the pictures will dry up. And very quickly, how many journalists were on the ground in Grozny for that assault? So this becomes very problematic. And you just have to read, if you haven't seen it already, Nick Robinson's account in this week's Spectator of his escape from Kiev. Sorry, I have to call it Kiev now. He's quite an experienced journalist, and he was clearly scared witless by the first few days, and that sentiment will spread. So the difficulties of covering this are going to multiply very, very quickly. And once the images disappear from the TV screens, and the Russians didn't knock down the TV mast in Kyiv for nothing. They want to silence the media. That's what Putin's done in Russia for the last 20 years. And once that becomes a fact, then you could well see a shift in public opinion.
Well, and also, I hate to even raise this as a possibility, but if they kill Zelensky and there are no TV cameras there, inevitably the whole situation, we know what the media is like. We flip from one thing to another.
Do you think at this stage that Zelensky is more dangerous alive or dead? They didn't kill him quickly enough in some ways. The symbol he would become as a national symbol of Ukraine
I agree,
would almost be as valuable. Though, of course, we hope
if you watch the TV news at 10 o'clock every night, he is one of the main people on it. If he's not there, I don't think there's a replacement Zelensky there. And I think, there are already reports that the Russians have tried to kill him already. It's an awful... Yeah, exactly. It's an awful thing to even discuss, but you have to in these situations. Right, we're going to come. Thank you very much indeed for your question, William. We'll come back to more questions in just a moment. It's 8:32. The news headlines on LBC with Lottie Morley.
Ukrainian officials claim at least 21 children have died since Russian troops began their invasion last week. Members of the UN have voted overwhelmingly to condemn the conflict and have demanded Moscow withdraws its personnel immediately. Smoke can be seen coming from buildings across Ukraine, which have come under heavy fire from Russian missiles. The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken claims Kremlin-backed forces are destroying critical infrastructure like schools and hospitals. And the Russian billionaire Roman Abramovich has confirmed he's selling Chelsea Football Club. The oligarch is thought to be selling his properties in the UK as well, as the government considers imposing sanctions on him. LBC weather, rain for many tonight, particularly in the north and west, drier in the southeast, a low of 3 degrees.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
8:36. We have so many brilliant questions coming in tonight. I want to get through as many as possible, so I'm going to ask you all now to maybe abbreviate your answers just a little bit. Maya is in Tottenham. Hello, Maya.
Hello. I just wanted to say, what is the point of sanctioning Russia when you're not going to place sanctions on China?
Why would we place sanctions on China? Just explain.
Because China is supporting Russia.
Well, yeah, okay. They've actually abstained in the United Nations on these votes. I think saying they're supporting Russia is a stretch. James, let's go. I'll come to you in a minute. Come on, let's go to James first.
I mean, I don't think we are sanctioning Belarus, who are providing both military support and staging bases for Russia. And I think where someone is clearly a nation's actually being involved in the process of the attack, it's completely right to sanction them too. I'd sort of wondered whether this might be about some genuinely morally awful things that we know China is doing. You know, there's what's happening with the Uyghurs, and there's what's happened with Hong Kong, where we haven't really taken much sanction action against China, but given our historic ties and responsibility there, in many ways we created the situation. You know, we have made, I think, possibly the most generous offer for immigration for human rights reasons in the UK's history. But we haven't sanctioned China for those, and it's probably for the very simple reason that we wouldn't have that huge international movement because there isn't that clear invasion of another state. That isn't trying to say that that's worse than what's happening to the Uyghurs. It's just the sort of international coalition issues mean that we wouldn't have that groundswell of support. But over Russia, they're sort of not condemning Russia, but this hasn't happened thanks to material support from China.
Con.
All I would say is I think this talk of a sort of a new Sino-Russian pact is very overstated. I think Russia is very much the weaker partner. They had some military exercises last August, and the Russian soldiers came back complaining that they'd been bullied by the Chinese. So, let's not get carried away about this. I think China is very opportunistic. As somebody described it to me, China sees Russia as a gas station that will fuel its economy, and that's it.
Andrea.
Well, I mean, I'm sort of quite sympathetic to what Con says, but I must say, when this first really started to kick off, when this invasion first started, I was, I think, like many people, very concerned that China might think, right, now's the moment to go into Taiwan. The coast is clear, there's a bit of distraction going on there in Europe. And actually, what I've thought over the last few days, I'm genuinely interested to hear what you all think, that is that China are slightly kind of going, you're a bit mad for our liking, they're almost slightly backing off, and I think that veto said a lot, because if they were in some kind of Faustian pact, I think they would have supported Russia at the UN, and in particular today. So I actually think that potentially China could become an ally in this, but I'm no expert, and it's just the sense that I've had since that invasion started.
Totally agree, Fleur.
Well, it's the basis of international law that we have international borders, there are agreements, and clearly Putin has overstepped that by invading another country. That's the difference between China has not done that to another country. But I like the direction of James's answer about talking about where, and I hope that this opens up a discussion more widely about war crimes, crimes against humanity, and what is genocide and when we can take action. Because at the moment, the bar is set it's far too difficult to declare something a genocide, and therefore there are actions around the world of despots, of tyrants, or condemning whole peoples, which are not called out in the way that this action has been called out, but probably should be. So I hope we can have that discussion, and that's, I think, stretching the question a bit here, but it is a good one to ask.
I mean, one thing I'd be quite interested to hear Con sort of say quickly is I do think Russia has made life much, much more difficult for China when it comes to Taiwan, in that the sort of Western alliance, such as it is, feels the most united it's been maybe for about 30 years. And there's probably going to be some structural steps to reinforce that. And I wonder whether, having looked at this response, China might be reassessing any short or medium term intentions it had towards Taiwan.
Con?
Yeah, well, actually, I think the Chinese are far smarter than Russians. And I think if the Chinese are going to take Taiwan, they're not going to invade it militarily. They're going to do what they did in Hong Kong and undermine all the institutions in Taiwan until there's a point where the Taiwanese invite the Chinese to come in and look after them, which is a very different proposition. But I think, James, your point is right. There's to be a complete readjustment of the international sort of geopolitical structures. And as I said earlier, I'm very heartened that the Western alliance, which was looking very ragged, has suddenly got some spine.
Raj has sent in an interesting text. He says, why did India not vote for the UN resolution condemning what Russia is doing in Ukraine? Can anybody work this one out? Because I know there have been, I think they've even signed a defence agreement or something with Russia in the last week, Con. I don't know if you know anything about that.
Well, I mean, if you're sitting in Delhi, your enemy is China, right? So you're looking for friends and people to help you on that whole issue of the Sino-Indian. I mean, people say that the real next nuclear war was the first proper nuclear war between India and China. So the Indians are playing it smart. I mean, they abstained. I mean, the thing about that vote is that the Americans regarded China's abstention as a great diplomatic victory because, as Andrea was intimating, there was a real fear that China would support Russia at the Security Council, and that would probably have been the end of the Security Council, which is, in fact, another issue. What is the relevance of the Security Council today?
Well, we've had questions. In fact, I had one earlier on in the programme from someone saying, why can't Russia be ejected from the Security Council? And I said, well, I don't know. I don't know enough about the United Nations. But are there procedures for that to happen? Does anyone know?
Well, I believe Russia could veto any move to
exactly.
it.
Well, that's the problem. Yeah.
It was set up still in the Great Power era.
You'll need somebody on your programme, Iain, from Matrix Chambers to explain this to your audience.
Well, we might do that one day. Thank you very much indeed. We'll take more of your calls in a moment. It's coming up to 8:45.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
8:47. Andrea Leadsom, Fleur Anderson, James Ball and Con Coughlin with us taking your calls. Dan is our next caller in East Malling in Kent, a neighbour of mine. Hello, Dan.
Very good evening to you. How are you doing?
Evening. All right, thank you. What would you like to ask?
It doesn't seem a very long time ago, but you probably all remember that Keir Starmer in the House suggested that Russia Today, RT, be taken off the air when sanctions were being discussed. And at that moment in time, I did sort of wince a little bit because I thought, well, we're not China, we're not Russia, we don't do that sort of thing. Over the coming days, I've decided, I thought, well, actually, no, it needs to be taken off the air. And I think about 3 hours ago, Sky have blocked RT. It's no longer on air in the UK via Sky.
Or Freeview.
I don't know about that. I know the EU blocked it. My question really is, do you think it's right that we should be now blocking Russian state media in the UK?
Well, I suppose we should say it isn't the government that's blocked them. It is Sky and Freeview and Freesat. I don't expect that'll make any difference to Mr. Putin, because no doubt he'll kick the BBC out of Russia now as well. Fleur, this is quite a difficult one, isn't it? Because we are not a country that really believes in media censorship in that kind of way. I thought it was quite something for Keir Starmer to come out and say that directly, and I suspect it would have been something that there would have been people wincing on your benches a little bit.
It's a real crisis of freedom of speech, isn't it?
Yeah.
But this is unprecedented times. So we are calling for this, but also to go after the football and the ballet and sporting and cultural events, to say that there should be no stone unturned when we say that Russia must become a pariah state. And in that, we're not decrying Russians, we're decrying Putin's regime, and it's his regime that's running Russia today. So it's definitely the vehicle, the voice of Putin that we're saying there should be stopped. And at the same time, it's absolutely right that the World Service has set up a new service for Ukrainians to be able to listen to news. They set up a shortwave radio station, and that's what we're doing to preserve freedom of speech. That's where our focus should be, not in allowing Putin to have his voice wherever he wants it.
Excuse me, but given RT has a tiny audience, isn't it a good idea for people to actually be able to watch it and see how ridiculous the propaganda actually is? Because I'm not a viewer of Russia Today, but over the last week I have watched it a few times just to see what they're like, and it is just blatant propaganda. And I don't understand why Ofcom haven't come down on them like a ton of bricks already. They don't need a long investigation. They just need to watch something once and say, well, that doesn't conform to our code. But actually, Sky and Freeview and Freesat, they've done their job for them.
So it's symbolic, but it absolutely matches everything that we're saying about sanctions should go as far as we can.
James, you've written a book sort of about media and censorship and social media.
Yep, I've also written on RT twice this week. And
have you?
Yes, about, not for.
I was going to say,
for.
I was about to jump down your throat.
Never. I think RT are utterly morally reprehensible. What they do is journalism, and they have helped gaslight about war crimes in Syria against violent acts in the UK. They acted as the English language propaganda for denying Salisbury. You know, they're reprehensible. Anyone who works for them and appears on them is reprehensible. And in a strict technical sense, Ofcom could have taken action years ago, because our broadcast airways are very heavily regulated and have lots of rules on fairness and impartiality that RT is routinely breached. So would we be within our rights to take them off the airways? Yes, and we could have done it long ago. Would it be wise? No, because Russia has made it clear it would tit for tat and stop Russians hearing the BBC and having BBC journalists in the country. Now, the value of the accurate, fair, good journalism the BBC does to Russia where the independent media, there are some valiant Russian journalists and independent outlets clinging on, but not many. The value of the BBC in Russia is so much greater than the harm RT does here, especially because it would be completely morally wrong for us to try and ban RT from the internet by government diktat. That would only help Putin suggest that we are the same as he is, and we don't allow unpopular or bad views to be aired. So I think they're awful. We should never engage with them, but we shouldn't ban them.
Andrea?
Well, I think there's the specific and then there's the more general. So on the specific case, I think we're all delighted that RT has been taken down, however it's been taken down. But I would say it was right that Ofcom should be the ones to do it, not the UK government, because looking at that in reverse, it would be for Russia or anyone else who fancies it to take down the BBC, which we would not support for their own end. So we can't sort of say, well, because we're the good guys, we can decide as a government to take down another radio station or TV station. So I think that the process has been right. And in general terms, I think that we should all stand up to defend law and freedom of speech. And, you know, I think where sanctions are concerned too, a lot of people are saying, sanction this person and that person. Well, actually, there is a process to go through. What we don't want to do is to just sanction someone, even though we've not got our sort of legal ducks in a row, because then we're making ourselves as bad as we are claiming that they are. So I think in the general principle, there has to be due process gone through, which means Ofcom.
Con, what's your view on this?
Well, there is a precedent, actually. The Iranians had something called Press TV, and one Jeremy Corbyn was one of their star guests or contributors, just like Alex Salmond is.
I must admit, I appeared on it 5 times until I realised what it was.
Well, they kept asking me to go on it. Unfortunately, I'd already written a book on the Iranian Revolution, so I knew what it was about. So I missed that pass. But Press TV was taken off the air because it just put out untrammeled propaganda, as does RT. So, and I think we are moving. There's enough fake news in the world already, and when you clearly identify something that is completely breaching our rules, then action should be taken. Just like Ofcom will act against the BBC when it is not quite as fair and accurate as it should be in its reporting.
But actually, I would just add to that why is Ofcom taking so long? And I know that's not the question, but Ofcom should be on top of these things. It's got 27 complaints against RT and still hasn't decided to rescind its licence.
But I might wonder whether they'd been asked not to act against RT so as to not get the retaliation on the other side.
But that would indicate that the Russians would be right in saying that it is an arm of government, because the Russians aren't going to discriminate between Ofcom and the government. They will assume that Ofcom is the government, so it might be better if Ofcom just dropped the whole thing now. Right, we've got time for one more question. It's Ben in Clacton. Hello, Ben.
Hello. Yes, I want to know what the panel think about the MP's pay rise announced yesterday, when there's an article in the Times saying that they've got £40,000 per year pension benefits on top of their £82,000 salary, which is now £84,000.
I want short answers on this, which at least 2 of you are going to be very grateful for. Andrea, let's start with you. You were Leader of the House of Commons. You will have had to have dealt with this in the past.
Well, no, because actually, wonderfully, ever since I became an MP, its pay has been determined by an independent body that looks at pay for MPs, and MPs have nothing to do with it. I think the days of MPs voting to give themselves a pay rise are long behind us. It will be for individual MPs to decide what they do with that pay rise.
And what will you do?
Well, as it happens, I'm donating to Ukraine and have tended to do that for several years. But at the same time, it is for every MP. It is their salary and they've earned it. And the independent assessment says that that's what they should be earning. So I just don't think anyone should be judging what other colleagues do with it.
I think I read this morning it is the same as other public sector workers.
Exactly.
Are getting.
Yeah.
Fleur?
It's 2.7%.
Yeah.
Nurses are getting 3%, and that's not enough for nurses. So I was glad for the last 2 years that our pay hasn't risen, because it was absolutely the wrong time to do it, and it's probably still the wrong time to do it. But I'm glad.
Is there ever a right time?
Is there ever
That's
a right
the problem,
time? We can't leave pay never going up for anyone, and I would absolutely campaign for other public sector pay rise to go up. But I know we're paid very generously.
Con.
Well, actually, I think politicians have paid very badly. I think it's ludicrous that the Prime Minister's paid less than most of the senior civil service. And I think if MPs were properly paid, then we wouldn't have all these constant problems with sleaze and people trying to cut corners with expenses and all the, I work at the Telegraph, which exposed the whole MP's expenses scandal. Why did that happen? Because they were compensating for low salaries. So, I would actually have a complete overhaul of the way we pay our elected representatives.
James, very quickly.
So I'm of the political left. I'm generally in favour of public servants getting pay rises. I think MPs could make this much, much easier for themselves by locking in every year that MPs get the weighted average of public sector pay rises. So what the other people who work for the public sector get, that's the percentage MPs get.
Short and sweet, thank you very much indeed. We have a final text from Joe in Northwood, who says, Iain, really interesting listening to and watching on Global Player, the panel on tonight's Cross Question. Quick 60-second question on World Book Day, which I think is tomorrow. What is the panel reading and why? James.
So I'm reading an academic book from the 1960s on nuclear deterrence.
Why?
I think the reasons why are probably a bit depressing, so I hope someone's got a more cheerful one.
I'm reading a book called Failures of State, which goes back to the beginning of the COVID crisis, which is very quite nerdy, probably, but I would recommend it as reading of reminding us what happened, because I'm looking at the COVID inquiry and what it will be covering.
Con?
I just read a really good book, which I recommend by an American academic called Amy Surratt, on how Yeltsin and Clinton came so close to doing a deal on the future of Europe post the collapse of the Iron Curtain. I recommend it to everybody. History could have been very different, and Ukraine wouldn't be happening today.
Well, indeed. Andrea, are you going to lighten the mood somewhat?
Well, I could, because I'm reading two things, but I want to make one point. I'm reading a book called Humankind, which actually turns on its head the idea that Lord of the Flies is actually how humans respond when left on a desert island. And it basically goes through painstakingly from the beginning of time and proves that actually human beings are essentially kind and cooperative. And it's all of the other stuff that gets in the way. So it's, in a sense, it's uplifting in its own way.
And what's your other book?
The other book is fantastic. It's a drama by Colleen McCullough about the history of the development of the Roman Empire, which I always love to read because it reminds me of the EU. But let's not go there, Iain.
No, let's not. I've started reading. I've started.
It's not in Latin, Con. Honestly, it's in English.
Okay, all right.
I've started reading Never by Ken Follett, which is about a Third World War.
Oh, dear.
Thank you all very much. Con Coughlin, Andrea Leadsom, James Ball and Fleur Anderson. We'll be back with another Cross Question on Monday. If you've missed any of our episodes this week, you can find them on Global Player or on the LBC YouTube channel. We're going to talk about how you counter Russian disinformation in just a moment. Love to have your calls on that. 0345 6060 973. You're listening to LBC. I'm Iain Dale. It's 9 o'clock.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock. The White House has announced more sanctions against Russia and its ally Belarus as the invasion into Ukraine escalates. They include extending export control